Semion Mogilevich, a name most people have never heard, but in secret reports of the FBI, CIA, and European agencies, he has another title: the boss of all bosses. Not a flashy Italian don from a movie, not a loud New York street gangster, but a quiet, educated, almost boring-looking man they call one of the most dangerous criminals in the world. While ordinary people live their lives, he moves billions across borders with just a signature, hides behind shell companies, and pulls strings inside banks, governments, and mafias like a ghost. Very little is publicly known about his childhood. He was born into an ordinary Jewish family in the Soviet Union, not into a famous criminal dynasty. No glamour, no legend, just a boy who was very, very good with numbers. After finishing school, he went to the Ivan Franko National University of Lviv and studied economics. On paper, he looked like the perfect Soviet professional, educated, serious, disciplined. But behind that clean profile, something else was forming. In the lecture halls, he wasn't just learning theory, he was quietly understanding how the Soviet economy really worked. State control, currency restrictions, black markets, desperate people, and most importantly, where the cracks in the system were. When he graduated, he didn't become a traditional banker or office worker. In the 1970s, foreign currency in the Soviet Union was tightly controlled by the government. Regular citizens were not allowed to freely buy or sell dollars or other foreign money. Whenever the state tries to control something so completely, a shadow market appears. Mogilevich saw that shadow clearly. He realized criminals, smugglers, and even ordinary people needed access to foreign currency, but couldn't get it legally. So he quietly stepped into that space. He began to provide illegal currency conversion services to criminal gangs. He wasn't the man holding a gun in the street. He was the man who made sure the money moved, was washed and multiplied. This was his first real step into crime. He became the money guy, the person gangsters went to when they needed currency or financial tricks. But in a system as tight as the Soviet Union, nobody runs an illegal currency operation forever without attention. In 1974, the authorities caught him. He was convicted for violating currency transaction rules and sent to prison. For most people, prison is a punishment. For Mogilevich, it was a classroom. Inside jail, he met other criminals, made contacts, learned about different operations, and started to understand the deeper structure of organized crime. He wasn't just a small-time operator anymore. 3 years later, after serving time, he was released. But freedom didn't change his path. Not long after, he was convicted again, this time for fraud, and sent back to prison for 4 years. 2 separate sentences, one for currency crimes, one for fraud. 2 chances to connect with more dangerous people, to study their methods and quietly build his own future empire. These years behind bars shaped him. He understood something important. Brute force has limits, but money and information don't. A man with a gun controls a street. A man with money, accounts, and access can control entire networks. So when Mogilevich came out again, he didn't try to become a street boss. He decided to become something much more dangerous, a criminal businessman. To the outside world, his next move looked almost innocent. He started a funeral planning business. Nothing seems more respectable than helping grieving families with burials and ceremonies. By all accounts, this business was legitimate on the surface. It operated like a normal company, paid its taxes, had official paperwork. To neighbors and local authorities, he looked like a quiet entrepreneur trying to help people in their darkest moments. But this clean business gave him exactly what he needed: a mask of respectability, a legal income source to mix with illegal money, and access to local officials, clients, and networks. While people saw him as a businessman, he was studying the next level: how to move from local scams and currency tricks into international operations. He knew the Soviet system was weakening. He could feel the cracks forming in the empire. and he was already planning how to profit when it finally broke. In the 1980s, his criminal career truly exploded. Many Jewish families in Russia and Ukraine wanted to emigrate, especially to Israel. They were preparing to leave everything behind. They couldn't carry their apartments, furniture, art, or jewelry with them. So they needed someone they could trust to sell those valuables after they left and send them the money abroad. Someone who understood markets, spoke the right languages, and looked respectable. That someone was Semion Mogilevich. He presented himself as a helpful middleman. Families would come to him with their jewelry, antiques, and artwork. The deal was simple. He would buy or take custody of their valuables, sell them at a fair price in the future, and then transfer the money to them in their new country once everything's settled. On the surface, he was doing them a favor. They were scared. They were leaving the only country they had ever known. They needed hope and trusted him with their life savings. But Mogilevich did not return the trust. He took their valuables, sold them, and then simply kept the money. The families waited in Israel and other countries for funds that never came. They had escaped one system only to be betrayed by the man they thought was helping them. For Mogilevich, it was a massive financial win. For his victims, it was the theft of their past and the destruction of their security. That one scam alone helped him quickly become a millionaire. With this new wealth, he moved from simple fraud into something bigger. He began funding jewelry stores and manufacturing businesses across Eastern and Western Europe. These businesses looked legal, paid rent, had employees, had inventory, but many of them were fronts. Through them, he could launder stolen goods and dirty money. The jewelry stores were especially useful. They weren't just selling rings and necklaces, they were the final stop for items stolen from churches, museums, private homes, and synagogues. His network would steal religious icons from churches, golden and silver items from synagogues, fine art from museums, and precious antiques from collectors' homes. These objects were then funneled into his operations, washed through shops and middlemen, and finally resold into the global market as if they had clean histories. By this time, Mogilevich wasn't just a scammer. He had become a central figure in a web of art theft, cultural looting, and organized money laundering spread across multiple countries. Around the same period, his connections to violent networks deepened. In the Soviet Union, there was a youth movement often referred to as the Lubutsi Gang. It started as a group of tough young men from a Moscow suburb who were into athletics, bodybuilding, gymnastics, boxing. They claimed to defend Soviet society from Western influence, hated hippies and punks, and followed a kind of strict street code. No attacks on women, no cheating in fights, no tolerance for fascists. But over time, some of these so-called patriotic tough guys were pulled into the world of organized crime. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, as criminal syndicates grew, they needed soldiers, strong, disciplined young men willing to use violence. Former athletes, ex-police, ex-military, and members of groups like Lubutsi became perfect recruits. Mogilevich was associated with this world, which meant he no longer just had money, he had access to muscle. He was also linked, according to many reports, to Sergei Mikhailov, the founder of the powerful Solntsevskaya Bratva, one of the largest and most feared Russian organized crime groups. Mikhailov's group controlled territories, roads, and businesses, especially around the M3 highway, leading to Ukraine and other strategic spots. They were deeply involved in the car import business and various rackets. For Mogilevich, this relationship was extremely valuable. He provided brains, financial engineering, and international connections. They provided enforcement, transportation routes, and raw power. But criminal friendships are fragile, and money has a way of turning allies into enemies. At some point, there was a serious dispute between Mogilevich and his powerful partners, reportedly over millions of dollars. And when criminals fight over that kind of money, the result is rarely just an argument. In the mid-1990s, a dramatic scene played out in Prague a fancy hotel, a nightclub show, lights, music, dancers, wealthy guests and hidden agendas. Among the people expected that night were dangerous figures from Eastern European organized crime, including those with grudges and old business against Mogilevich. According to later accounts, a hit on his life may have been planned during a glamorous cabaret performance there. Former FBI agent Bob Levinson described what happened. While guests were enjoying the show, ropes suddenly dropped from the ceiling. Armed members of a special police unit stormed the room, jumping on the stage with machine guns, ordering everyone not to move. The message was clear: something very ugly was about to happen, and the authorities needed control of that room. At the same time, an Uzbek drug trafficker and other heavy criminals were reportedly present. Some believe a murder was being quietly prepared for that evening. Mogilevich himself later claimed that he arrived late, saw the police presence, and quickly left, choosing to hide in another hotel until dawn. Others suspect a high-ranking contact warned him before it was too late. Whatever the truth, he slipped away again. The aftermath was serious. The Czech Interior Ministry banned him from the country for 10 years. Hungary declared him unwelcome. The United Kingdom barred him from entering, calling him one of the most dangerous men in the world. By now, he wasn't just a local crime figure. He was known across Europe as a mastermind, someone at the center of currency crimes, massive frauds, art theft, prostitution, arms deals, and elaborate money laundering schemes. And yet, despite all this, most ordinary people still had no idea he existed. यहीं तक पहला पार्ट खत्म होता है, यहाँ तक हम उस पॉइंट तक आ गए हैं जहां सेमियोन मोगिलेविच एक छोटे स्कैमर से इंटरनेशनल गोस्ट बनने की तरफ बढ़ चुका है। बांस, कनेक्शंस, फ्रंट बिजनेसेस, गैंग्स सब रेडी। अगले पार्ट में हम उसके टैक्स हेवंस, एरगॉन लिमिटेड, अर्बट इंटरनेशनल, नाइट क्लब्स, सेक्स ट्रैफिकिंग नेटवर्क, बैंकिंग एम्पायर और बिलियन डॉलर मनी लॉन्ड्रिंग ऑपरेशंस को डिटेल में स्क्रिप्ट की तरह कंटिन्यू करेंगे। Semion Mogilevich had now stepped beyond the borders of the Soviet world. By the early 1990s, he was no longer just a criminal with influence. He was a strategist with global reach. He understood something most gangsters never learn. Crime becomes unstoppable when it looks like business. And so, he built an empire that lived inside boardrooms, behind accountants, in offshore banks, and under the protection of governments that didn't even realize he was using them. His first major step into this new world began in 1990 on a small island between France and the UK, Alderney, one of the Channel Islands. It is a place known not for violence or corruption, but for something even more attractive to criminals: tax havens and quiet financial laws. It was here that Mogilevich registered Aragon Limited. On paper, Aragon was harmless, a trading company dealing in consumer goods, a business any ordinary investor could walk past and never think twice about. But behind the paperwork, Aragon was becoming the central hub for his global money laundering operations. Through it, he began moving millions through Switzerland, London, New York, Stockholm, temporary hiding places for money that originally came from stolen art, extortion, fraud, and trafficking. This was the moment when Mogilevich stopped being a regional criminal and became an international financial ghost. In 1991, he expanded that ghost network even further by creating another company, Arbat International, in Moscow. This one dealt with oil exports and energy contracts, a legitimate industry, but also the perfect cover. Oil money is enormous. If you hide dirty money inside clean oil revenue, it becomes almost impossible for law enforcement to separate the two. Arbat International gave him access to one of the most lucrative sectors of the collapsing Soviet economy. But Mogilevich was doing more than creating businesses. He was strategically placing himself inside political and economic systems, just as the Soviet Union was about to crumble. The chaos of that collapse created a window only someone with his intelligence could exploit. In 1991, he quietly moved to Hungary, taking with him not only his money, but the woman who would become his third wife, Katalin Pap. Their marriage gave him something priceless, a Hungarian passport, and with it, the ability to travel freely across Europe. This was far more valuable than any gun. In Hungary, he bought a fortified villa just outside Budapest. Not a flashy mafia mansion, but a quiet fortress-like home where he could plan operations while appearing like a wealthy, legitimate businessman. From this base, he began investing in factories, companies, and even an armament manufacturer, a company that built anti-aircraft systems. According to later CIA reports, Mogilevich even supplied Iran with armored vehicles and missiles worth millions. This was no longer crime for money. It was crime with geopolitical reach. At the same time, he returned to an old interest, jewelry and antiques. He created a scheme in Budapest where he would take expensive Fabergé eggs, priceless decorative art pieces, to restore them. But after receiving the originals, he quietly replaced them with expertly crafted fakes and sent the forgeries back to the owners. The real ones sold at auctions for enormous profits. If anyone doubted his intelligence before, operations like this made it clear. Mogilevich's mind worked like a machine, calm, logical, predatory. Then came his move into the world of nightclubs. Budapest and Prague in the early 1990s were filled with tourists, new money, and freedom after decades of communist rule. They were also full of vulnerable women from Eastern Europe. Women desperate for work, safety, and escape from poverty. Mogilevich created a chain of elite nightclubs called Black and White. On the surface, they were glamorous entertainment venues. Behind the scenes, they were hubs for exploitation. Sex work, once hidden in the Soviet era, had exploded during economic collapse. Governments attempted to legalize and tax it, but this only made it easier for criminals to industrialize it. Mogilevich's clubs became central nodes in a larger trafficking network. Women from Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the former Soviet states were promised modeling jobs, hospitality work, or travel opportunities. Instead, many found themselves trapped in prostitution rings controlled by his organization. This wasn't a small-time brothel scheme. This was a multinational business structure generating millions annually and protected by corrupt officials who had no incentive to interfere. While building this empire, Mogilevich's power grew inside Russia as well. He began acquiring influence inside Income Bank, one of Russia's largest private banks. Banks weren't just financial institutions, they were gateways to power, political favors, and access to restricted systems. Through secret deals with the bank's president, Mogilevich became a hidden force behind its operations. That access allowed him to launder money at a level criminals could only dream of. But big gains come with big risks. In 1998, following Russia's financial collapse, the bank fell apart. Billions evaporated, but Mogilevich didn't. He had already moved his interests elsewhere. This was also the period when he began attracting serious attention from the FBI, not because of violence, but because he had engineered one of the largest investor frauds ever seen, the YBM Magnex International scam, a Canadian company near Philadelphia supposedly selling industrial magnets that looked legitimate enough to attract investors. It had offices, factories, products, everything seemed real. Except the entire company was an illusion. Behind it was Mogilevich, pulling the strings and siphoning off more than $150 million from investors. Money flowed out of the US through shell companies into offshore accounts. The FBI opened a massive investigation, but Mogilevich himself never set foot in the United States. He orchestrated the entire operation from thousands of miles away. Investigators later said that he was the most dangerous kind of criminal, one who committed enormous crimes without ever appearing at the scene. Agents described him as a man who could pick up a phone in Budapest and cause financial damage in Philadelphia, Berlin, Moscow, or London within minutes. And the deeper the FBI dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Arms trafficking, nuclear material smuggling, stolen art, drugs, prostitution rings, bank fraud, tax havens, shell companies. Every illegal industry had threads connecting back to him. This was no longer one man. This was a system built with intelligence, expanded with political relationships, and protected with violence supplied by some of the most brutal gangs of the post-Soviet era. By the late 1990s, European authorities, the FBI, Israeli intelligence, and even the CIA were all watching him. But watching was all they could do. Because Mogilevich was no longer living like a criminal, he was living like a man above criminals, a strategist who used governments against one another, who used corruption like currency, and who made himself untouchable simply by understanding the rules better than the people meant to enforce them. By the late 1990s, Mogilevich's name, though unfamiliar to the public, was becoming a quiet alarm behind the closed doors of intelligence agencies. The FBI, MI5, German BND, Israeli Mossad, and Interpol all had fragments of his operations, yet none had the full picture, and that was precisely how he wanted it. His genius wasn't just in committing crimes, it was in distributing pieces of the truth so widely that no single government could assemble them fast enough to stop him. But while the West struggled to understand him, Mogilevich was building alliances that made him more dangerous than anyone realized. It began with the Red Mafia. This wasn't a name chosen for style or terror. It was the term used by international investigators for the network of former Soviet soldiers, Afghan war veterans, ex-KGB operatives, and hardened street criminals who now worked under his command. These were men trained in torture, in psychological warfare, in covert operations, and in obedience without question. They did not see Mogilevich as a gangster. They saw him as a strategist, a provider, a general with bottomless resources, and he used them with terrifying precision. Businessmen who refused his offers were not simply threatened, they were erased. Their bodies would often be discovered with marks so brutal that even rival criminal groups avoided interfering. Torture was used not just to punish, it was used to send a message that refusing him was not a business decision. It was a death sentence. Yet despite this violence, Mogilevich rarely appeared in public. He didn't attend meetings, didn't shout, didn't threaten. He let his network speak for him. When a crime needed to be committed, he was never in the same country. When a deal needed to be signed, someone else held the pen. When someone needed to disappear, the killers had never even met him. That distance made him untouchable. And it was during these years that one of his closest allies began talking. Monya Elson, a powerful mob figure who called Mogilevich his best friend. Their partnership stretched across continents. When Elson was shot in Brooklyn, Mogilevich personally arranged for him to be flown out of the US and hidden in Italy, protected until he recovered. This level of loyalty in the underworld was unheard of, but Mogilevich knew exactly what he was buying: devotion from men who would kill or die on command. It was also this period where his connections expanded into the highest levels of Western finance. One of the biggest shocks came in 1998, when newspapers across the world suddenly reported that $10 billion had been laundered from Russia through the Bank of New York. The accounts used for this operation were linked to shell companies controlled by Mogilevich. Billions moved quietly through New York's financial system without him ever setting foot in the US. He had infiltrated Wall Street without leaving Europe. This wasn't just a crime, it was a demonstration, a message to global authorities. You cannot stop me, you cannot find me, and even if you do, you cannot touch me. Around this same time, journalists began to notice him. One, in particular, paid the highest price for digging too deeply. Robert Friedman, the writer who exposed Mogilevich in The Village Voice. After publishing detailed reports based on FBI and Mossad documents, Friedman received word from the CIA that a $100,000 contract had been placed on his life. His crime? Revealing too much truth. It was Mogilevich who had ordered the hit. The message was simple: I will not be talked about. But even this did not stop the expansion of his empire. By now, Mogilevich controlled trafficking networks across Eastern Europe, prostitution pipelines through Hungary and Prague, drug smuggling routes into Russia, stolen art circuits in Europe, arms deals that reached the Middle East, banks that cleaned dirty money into clean investments, and airline access used for smuggling cargo without inspection. He also increased his political reach. Former Soviet security officers, now rebranded as businessmen, met him secretly in Hungary to exchange intelligence and favors. Some of them held positions close to the Kremlin, others controlled regional governments. He didn't need to run for office, he only needed politicians who owed him favors. By the time Western investigators understood how powerful he had become, he was already 2 steps ahead. He stopped using the same name. He stopped living at the same address. He traveled with passports under aliases. He had lawyers in every major European capital. Journalists described him as a man without a country, because he belonged to the shadows between nations, where no law truly applies. And then, almost unexpectedly, he vanished. For months at a time, no one could confirm where he was. Rumors spread. Some said he had moved to Switzerland, others claimed Cyprus. Some believed he had returned to Russia. It didn't matter. As long as his money moved, Mogilevich existed everywhere. His criminal evolution had reached something no other mob boss had ever achieved. He stopped being a man and became a system. By the early 2000s, Semion Mogilevich had grown far beyond the criminal networks that first shaped him. He was no longer just a mob strategist or a financial mastermind. He had become a man whose influence seeped into the foundations of governments, corporations, and energy systems across Europe. And the most unsettling part was how quietly he had done it. While most crime bosses relied on violence or intimidation, Mogilevich relied on economics, politics, and long-term planning. He understood something that frightened even the most seasoned investigators. True power isn't in guns or muscle, it's in essential resources. And Europe had one weakness that he recognized before almost anyone else: its dependence on natural gas. For years, several European countries had relied heavily on Russian gas to survive the winter. What most people didn't understand was how fragile that system actually was. Pipelines stretched across borders, passing through Ukraine before reaching Western Europe. Any disruption, political conflict, technical failure, or strategic manipulation could leave millions without heat. Mogilevich saw an opportunity where governments saw vulnerability. He realized that whoever controlled those pipelines didn't just control fuel. They controlled economies, elections, and leverage over entire nations. His first real step into this world came quietly in 1991 with the creation of a company called Arbat International. Officially, it was a petrol import-export business. In reality, it was his doorway into the energy sector, a sector where billions moved through contracts nobody fully understood, and where one well-placed intermediary could become indispensable. Arbat allowed him to analyze energy pricing, transit fees, and regional bottlenecks. He didn't want to be a part of the system. He wanted to understand how to manipulate it. Then, in 2002, something unusual happened. A new company appeared in Hungary, Ural Transgas, or ETG. On paper, it was a legitimate business created to handle natural gas sales between Turkmenistan and Ukraine. In truth, it was formed by Mogilevich's personal lawyer and operated like a financial ghost. No major offices, nominee directors who had no idea what the company actually did, and ownership hidden behind layers of offshore structures. But this ghost company suddenly became responsible for billions of dollars in natural gas transactions. It wasn't luck, it wasn't coincidence. Mogilevich had positioned ETG exactly where governments needed a trusted intermediary, even though almost everyone in intelligence circles knew who was actually pulling the strings. When ETG began drawing too much attention, it quietly disappeared, only to be replaced by an even more powerful entity, Ukrainian-born, a Swiss-registered company co-owned by Gazprom, Ukrainian oligarch Dmytro Firtash, and behind the scenes, Semion Mogilevich himself. This new structure was bigger, more protected, and wrapped in layers of political insulation. Billions flowed through it each year, and this time the operations weren't limited to gas supply. The company influenced pricing, negotiation terms, transit operations, and revenue distribution. It was the perfect system, too essential to eliminate and too complicated for outsiders to fully understand. Years later, when asked about Mogilevich, Dmytro Firtash casually admitted that he had needed Mogilevich's permission to operate businesses in Ukraine as early as 1986. He also claimed no one could run major operations in Ukraine without the approval of criminal structures. His comments weren't just explanations, they were confirmations of how deeply embedded Mogilevich was in the country's economy. He didn't hold power by force. He held it because businessmen, politicians, and officials needed him to keep the system functioning. Even Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko eventually spoke publicly about it. She claimed she had documentation proving criminal organizations were behind Ukrainian-born. She was one of the only high-ranking officials brave enough to say it out loud. Soon after, she found herself politically crushed and imprisoned. Many believed her downfall was directly connected to the forces she had threatened. Challenging Mogilevich didn't always require retaliation. Often the system quietly removed his obstacles for him. By this time, Western intelligence agencies faced a disturbing reality. They all agreed Mogilevich was one of the most dangerous organized crime figures in the world, but they also recognized a troubling truth. Removing him could destabilize Eastern Europe's energy sector. Arresting him wasn't just difficult, it could create economic chaos. That made him uniquely protected. He was too valuable, too deeply woven into Europe's infrastructure, and too knowledgeable about the financial weaknesses of multiple nations. He didn't need to hide because the system itself shielded him. Yet while he expanded into energy markets, Mogilevich never abandoned his criminal roots. He still oversaw operations involving drug trafficking, art theft, stolen antiques, prostitution networks, and large-scale money laundering. Through compromised officials, he even gained access to airports and transport routes, allowing him to move everything from heroin to weapons with little oversight. His empire wasn't built on one industry, it was built on dozens, each feeding into the other. What shocked investigators most was that while many countries considered him a threat, others quietly worked with him. Germany's intelligence service reportedly entered into a covert agreement with him to gain information on Russian crime groups. When that partnership was revealed, it created outrage across Europe. But the truth was simple. Governments that couldn't penetrate Russian criminal structures saw Mogilevich as their only viable doorway. He was a criminal, yes, but he was also an asset. By the mid-2000s, the FBI had finally had enough. They placed him on the 10 most wanted list and publicly labeled him the most dangerous mobster in the world. One agent described him as a man for whom human life meant nothing and whose motivations revolved solely around money and influence. But even with that label, and even with decades of criminal allegations behind him, the FBI couldn't get close. Mogilevich remained in Moscow, protected by a government that refused extradition and surrounded by networks that benefited from his survival. At this stage, he wasn't hiding underground or avoiding attention. He was living comfortably, conducting business and expanding his influence. He had become something rare, a criminal so deeply embedded in global systems that arresting him was nearly impossible. By 2008, Semion Mogilevich had reached a level of power few criminals in history had ever touched. He controlled money, resources, people, and systems that stretched across continents. Intelligence agencies in the US, Europe, and even Russia viewed him as a threat, yet none of them could move against him without triggering political or economic fallout. For years, journalists, investigators, and federal agencies chased his trail, only to discover that every path led to dead ends: offshore companies, false identities, shell corporations, and financial tunnels that vanished into jurisdictions no one could penetrate. It seemed impossible that a man so protected, so insulated, would ever be caught. But then, in January 2008, something happened that stunned the world. Russian authorities arrested him. The moment itself wasn't dramatic. Mogilevich wasn't found in a hidden bunker or on the run. He wasn't surrounded by helicopters, armored vehicles, or federal agents. Instead, he was simply standing outside a supermarket in Moscow, wearing jeans, a leather jacket, and a cap, when approximately 50 officers suddenly swarmed the area. They surrounded him, handcuffed him, and took him away as calmly as they would arrest a shoplifter. Even his bodyguards, always nearby, were detained. The headlines spread instantly. Russia arrests one of the world's most wanted mob bosses. To the world, it seemed like justice had finally arrived. But to those who truly understood Mogilevich, the timing felt strange. Something didn't add up. Russia claimed the arrest was not for murder, not for arms trafficking, not for laundering billions, and not for international fraud. Instead, the charges were almost laughable compared to the scale of his known criminal empire: tax evasion. He was detained under a different name, Sergei Schneider, a name that Russian authorities admitted he had been using for years, along with several other legal identities. A spokeswoman even told reporters that Mogilevich had been wanted for over 15 years by multiple countries, but this arrest was purely about unpaid taxes. Investigators demanded around $5.5 million in back taxes and fines. To most people, that amount was enormous, but in Mogilevich's world, it was loose change, less than he could make from a single money laundering cycle. Still, he remained behind bars while the case began to unfold. Russia insisted this wasn't politically motivated, and that he was simply facing the same legal procedures anyone else would. But behind closed doors, Western intelligence agencies watched carefully. They knew Russia was fiercely protective of Mogilevich, so why arrest him now? Meanwhile, his associate, Russian businessman Vladimir Nekrasov, owner of the massive Arbat prestige perfume chain, was arrested alongside him. Like Mogilevich, he was accused of tax evasion. Again, the story didn't sit right with observers. The numbers were too small, the charges too ordinary, especially when both men were suspected of running one of the world's most powerful criminal networks. Months passed, and still there was no trial. No dramatic courtroom scenes, no extradition request granted, no international cooperation. Instead, everything moved slowly, quietly, almost as if the aim wasn't to prosecute, but simply to buy time. Then, in July 2009, barely a year and a half later, Russia released Mogilevich from custody. No major announcement, no press conferences, no explanations. Officials stated that his detention period had simply expired and that the charges were not severe enough to justify keeping him imprisoned. They claimed the investigation was still ongoing, but anyone paying attention understood what had just happened. Russia had no intention of letting him face foreign justice. 2 years later, in 2011, the charges were dropped entirely. Official statements said there was an absence of crime, a phrase so vague and dismissive that even Russian journalists questioned whether the cases had ever been real to begin with. The United States was furious. The FBI had spent years investigating Mogilevich, gathering evidence, constructing indictments, and placing him on the 10 most wanted list. They wanted him extradited to face fraud, racketeering, money laundering, and securities violations. But Russia refused, claiming that their constitution prohibited the extradition of its citizens. And since Mogilevich held Russian citizenship, he was untouchable. For investigators, it was like watching the door slam shut in slow motion. He had been in their grasp, or close enough for hope, but now he was out again, free to resume his operations under the protection of one of the world's most powerful governments. His arrest seemed less like justice and more like a symbolic gesture, an act meant to reassure the world that Russia was doing something, while in reality doing nothing at all. The deeper researchers looked, the stranger the story became. Russian courts hinted at procedural violations. Tax authorities withdrew their claims. Arbitration courts cancelled financial investigations. Everything collapsed neatly, piece by piece, as if someone had quietly issued the order to make the problem disappear. Mogilevich himself claimed he was innocent, that jealous business rivals had invented the accusations to ruin him. Whether that was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that he walked away untouched, unpunished, and more confident than ever. After his release, he returned to his comfortable life in Moscow. He didn't flee, he didn't hide, he didn't need to. He lived openly, protected by political connections, legal technicalities, and the simple reality that too many powerful people depended on the systems he helped create. For Western agencies, his arrest and release confirmed something they had always suspected. Semion Mogilevich was not just a criminal. He was a strategic asset, one whose value extended far beyond the underworld. Governments might publicly condemn him, but behind closed doors, many benefited from the same grey networks he operated within. And as he stepped back into his life, Russia made one thing clear: they would never hand him over. Not to the FBI, not to Interpol, not to anyone. He was home, and in Russia, Semion Mogilevich was safe. Even as international pressure mounted and his name continued to circulate through intelligence briefings, Semion Mogilevich carried on with a calmness that unnerved the agencies hunting him. He behaved not like a fugitive, but like a man who understood exactly how untouchable he was. And the most frightening part was that he was right. From Moscow, he continued to operate within a world carefully constructed to protect him. His connections extended into political structures, corporate frameworks, and criminal alliances that formed a web so complex that unraveling it would require a level of cooperation between countries that simply did not exist. While governments bickered, Mogilevich continued to expand his influence in ways that were difficult to trace but impossible to ignore. One thing became clear: he was shifting his empire again, this time deeper into financial markets, offshore banking, and global shell corporations. Traditional crime was still part of his network, but Mogilevich understood that the future of power wasn't in physical territories or violent displays. It was in money that could slip across borders instantly, in digital footprints that could be erased, in offshore accounts that existed behind layers of legal protection. Throughout the early 2010s, reports suggested that Mogilevich had become a silent architect behind major financial movements connected to businessmen, politicians, and even state-owned companies. Some transactions were so obscure that even seasoned investigators struggled to determine where the money originated, who handled it, or where it ended. It wasn't just laundering, it was orchestration. Analysts began describing his financial operations as economic fog. Within this fog, entire sums of money, sometimes millions, sometimes billions, would move quietly, circumventing regulations and bypassing anti-money laundering systems in ways that appeared almost elegant. His criminal empire was no longer just committing crimes, it was reshaping the mechanics of global economics. Intelligence agencies across Europe grew increasingly concerned that Mogilevich had embedded himself into industries that affected national security. Concerns surrounding Eastern European energy pipelines resurfaced as more evidence suggested he still had indirect control over certain intermediaries and trade routes. Even after supposedly stepping away, his fingerprints appeared in unexpected places: advice given to oligarchs, sudden business partnerships, strategic investments that benefited companies aligned with his interests. Meanwhile, in Russia, he lived without fear. He was protected not just by law, but by relevance. People in high positions still needed him. His knowledge, his contacts, and his ability to quietly solve problems made him valuable. He had information on politicians from Ukraine, Russia, Hungary, Israel, Austria, information that could destroy reputations and fracture alliances if it ever surfaced. As long as he held that information, he remained shielded. The FBI, frustrated by years of roadblocks, continued to update his wanted profile. They reminded the public that Mogilevich was believed to be involved in crimes ranging from drug trafficking to weapons sales to financial fraud on a global scale. But every update felt more symbolic than actionable. They knew where he was. They knew what he had done. Yet they couldn't touch him. Journalists continued attempting to investigate him, but the deeper they dug, the more dangerous their work became. Some received warnings, others were threatened indirectly. A few stepped back entirely, knowing that pursuing Mogilevich's story meant challenging not just a criminal, but an entire network of powerful people who wanted him left alone. Throughout all this, Mogilevich maintained the same quiet lifestyle: a villa in Moscow, private meetings with business partners, dinners with elites, and occasional sightings that seemed almost surreal considering his status as one of the FBI's 10 most wanted. There was something chilling about a man who could walk freely while being internationally recognized as one of the most dangerous criminals alive. But the truth was even darker. Mogilevich wasn't just living freely, he was evolving. The world was changing rapidly. Digital banking, cryptocurrencies, collapses in traditional regulatory systems, political tensions, and shifting alliances across Europe. These changes created new opportunities for exploitation, and Mogilevich was one of the few criminals with the intelligence to adapt faster than the governments trying to stop him. Rumors spread through law enforcement circles that he was investing in technologies capable of obscuring financial transfers. Others believed he had begun advising powerful oligarchs on how to shield their assets from sanctions. Some analysts suggested that he had established new financial networks in Turkey, Cyprus, and Dubai, places with strategic advantages and less regulatory scrutiny. Whether every rumor was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was the undeniable reality. Mogilevich's influence had not faded, it had shifted. Forms becoming harder to see, harder to trace, and far more dangerous. By the late 2010s, a simple but disturbing conclusion emerged among investigators. Mogilevich didn't need to commit crimes directly anymore. He had built a world where others did the work for him: politicians, businessmen, criminals, bankers, proxies, and intermediaries. He existed above the system, watching it move according to rules he helped establish. Every empire eventually declines, but Mogilevich's empire didn't collapse, it adapted. It became so deeply interwoven into the structure of modern corruption that removing it would require dismantling parts of global finance itself. And so he remained where he had always wanted to be: invisible, protected, powerful, and still one step ahead of the world. As the years moved forward, one unsettling truth became clearer to investigators around the world. Semion Mogilevich didn't need to be visible to control everything around him. His empire no longer relied on the traditional structure of a mafia syndicate. Instead, it operated like a vast ecosystem, one that drew strength from instability, corruption, and global financial loopholes. The more chaotic the world became, the more opportunities he found. By the time the 2020s approached, intelligence analysts noted a fascinating shift. While other criminal organizations struggled with technological changes, sanctions, financial monitoring, and political crackdowns, Mogilevich's network adapted with remarkable precision. He wasn't fighting the modern world, he was using it. Digital banking, cryptocurrency, offshore virtual companies, encrypted communication, and evolving global markets created new spaces for criminal innovation. And Mogilevich, more than anyone, understood how to exploit uncertainty. He didn't need to smuggle anything himself or oversee operations personally. His strength was strategic positioning, placing the right people in the right places and letting systems run on their own. Several investigators noticed a pattern. Whenever a financial scandal broke somewhere in Europe or the Middle East, the structure behind it resembled models previously associated with Mogilevich's operations. Not direct fingerprints, just the familiar architecture of hidden ownership, silent partners, multi-layered companies, and money that zigzagged through countries like a digital ghost. This made it nearly impossible to determine where his influence stopped and where global corruption began. Meanwhile, in Russia, Mogilevich lived quietly but comfortably. He wasn't flaunting wealth or power. He didn't need to. His silence became his shield. Many believed he spent his days in a secure residential area, private, monitored, insulated. Some claimed he rarely left his estate except for medical appointments or discreet business discussions. Others suggested he still hosted private gatherings with individuals whose names never appeared in headlines, but whose influence was undeniable. Through all this, he maintained a reputation that straddled two worlds. To criminals, he was a mastermind. To businessmen, he was a fixer. To politicians, he was a necessary evil. To investigators, he was a ghost. Western agencies continued to update their files on him, noting that he still ranked among the most dangerous global criminals. But danger takes many shapes. Mogilevich was no longer dangerous because of violence. He was dangerous because of leverage. He had decades of information stored in his mind. Names, transactions, secrets, alliances, betrayals, and financial networks that could expose people in high places. That alone kept him protected. A powerful but quiet fear surrounded him, the fear of what he knew. One European intelligence officer famously said, "Arresting Mogilevich would be like detonating a bomb inside international politics." The statement wasn't exaggeration. If he were ever forced to reveal everything he knew, the consequences could reach prime ministers, oligarchs, bankers, intelligence operatives, energy executives, and foreign diplomats. This invisible leverage was worth more than money. It was his insurance policy. At the same time, the underworld he had shaped continued evolving. Younger criminal networks, cybercrime groups, financial hackers, digital traffickers operated with tactics that resembled his earlier teachings. Even if they had never met him, they were unknowingly following the blueprint he built decades earlier. Move money without trace, separate leadership from action, hide behind legal structures, never give investigators a straight line to follow. His legacy wasn't a family or a mafia, it was a methodology. The FBI still maintained his profile, reminding the world that he remained wanted for massive fraud, racketeering, and laundering. But they also knew something else. Even if he stepped outside Russia for a moment, capturing him would not be simple. He had backup passports, political favors, covert supporters, and access to information that could trigger diplomatic crises. That level of insulation created a disturbing reality. The world's most dangerous mobster didn't need weapons, armies, or street-level criminals anymore. His influence lived inside financial systems, political relationships, and economic dependencies that spanned continents. And while law enforcement continued searching for cracks in his network, he remained several steps ahead, silent, patient, and always calculating. In conversations among investigators, one question repeatedly surfaced. How do you stop a man whose power increases every time the world becomes more corrupt? No one had an answer, because Mogilevich wasn't fighting the system. He had become part of it. embedded so deeply that removing him risked collapsing things no country was prepared to confront. And so he continued, aging, quiet, physically frailer than before, yet still carrying the same dangerous intelligence that built one of the largest criminal empires in history. A man whose name could unsettle governments, whose past could ruin careers, and whose presence remained a reminder that some criminals don't just navigate global corruption, they help create it. Even after decades of investigations, arrests, scandals, financial crises, collapses, and international tension, one fact remained unchanged. Semion Mogilevich was still free, still powerful, still untouchable. And for the agencies watching him, the most unsettling thought was this: his story still wasn't over. As the 21st century unfolded, something remarkable happened. While the world changed rapidly, Mogilevich's name never drifted far from the shadows of global crises. Whenever a scandal involving offshore accounts, energy disputes, political interference, or suspicious financial networks appeared, analysts found echoes of methods he had perfected decades earlier. It was as if his blueprint for corruption had seeped into the world's bloodstream. But behind the quietness of his later life, there were whispers that suggested he had not fully retired, only retreated deeper into layers of safety that no government dared to penetrate. Those who observed him closely understood his silence was not weakness, it was strategy. During these years, Russia's political environment continued tightening around power structures that preferred predictable allies. Mogilevich, once a figure of chaotic criminal influence, now blended seamlessly into this landscape, not by force, but by maintaining a network of valuable connections. Some of these connections stretched back decades. Others were newer alliances formed through mutual benefit and shared risk. Meanwhile, Europe and the United States became more dependent on the natural gas pipelines running through Eastern Europe. This created a geopolitical tension point, one that Mogilevich had anticipated long before most governments even recognized its threat. His early involvement in energy intermediaries placed him at the root of disputes that later defined international negotiations. Even when his name didn't appear on documents, insiders knew where the structure originated. Investigators in multiple countries quietly admitted that the challenge wasn't just finding Mogilevich, it was separating him from the systems he had helped build. Power, in his case, wasn't about control of men or weapons. It was about influence woven into financial markets and political pipelines. By now, global crime had evolved into cyber fraud, cryptocurrency laundering, and digital extortion, fields that did not need traditional mafia brutality. And yet, the mindset behind these operations, the obsession with anonymity, decentralization, offshore shells, complex corporate layering, felt unmistakably Mogilevich-like. Even the criminals of this new generation unknowingly followed his playbook. But there was another layer to his story, the information he held. Those who knew him personally described him as a walking vault, a memory filled with decades of deals, blackmails, financial secrets, bribes, betrayals, and hidden alliances that could topple governments if ever disclosed. He didn't need to threaten anyone. The implication of what he could reveal was enough to ensure protection. One European intelligence officer once said, "There are presidents who sleep better knowing Mogilevich remains silent." For law enforcement, this created an impossible dilemma. Capturing him could unlock devastating political repercussions. Leaving him free meant acknowledging that one of the world's most powerful criminals had effectively negotiated his own untouchability. His networks weren't just criminal, they were embedded into national economies. Removing him would mean pulling threads that might collapse entire structures. Meanwhile, individuals connected to his operations occasionally disappeared from public view. Some retired quietly, others relocated, and a few became wealthy overnight from business deals no one fully understood. These shifts suggested that his influence, though unseen, remained intact. What truly disturbed investigators, however, was a more philosophical question. How do you quantify the danger of a man whose greatest weapon is knowledge? By now, Mogilevich rarely appeared in public. When he did, he looked like an aging grandfather. Slow steps, heavy eyes, soft voice. He carried none of the theatrics associated with mafia legends. And yet, behind that appearance lay a mind capable of orchestrating billion-dollar frauds, political maneuvers, and international energy disputes without ever lifting a finger. Every few years, new rumors emerged. Claims that he advised oligarchs, mediated disputes between criminal factions, or facilitated offshore deals that moved through complex legal corridors. None of it could be proven, but none of it could be dismissed either. His criminal empire had evolved into something abstract, part financial mechanism, part political influence, part myth. And myths, unlike men, do not age. One particular fear lingered among investigators. If Mogilevich had truly stepped back, who inherited his knowledge? Who learned the architecture of his empire? Who was continuing the work behind the scenes? This question grew more urgent as new financial scandals emerged with uncanny similarities to his earlier operations. Investigators realized that even if Mogilevich disappeared tomorrow, the structures he built would continue functioning, driven by students who learned from him, directly or indirectly. It was no longer about one man. It was about a legacy of corruption so refined, so deeply integrated into global systems, that removing it might no longer be possible. For decades, journalists, crime historians, and intelligence analysts have searched for one final answer, one ultimate truth about the world's most dangerous mob boss. And the truth, perhaps, is this: Semion Mogilevich never needed to escape justice. He simply built a world where justice could not reach him. As the modern world pushes deeper into the digital age, Mogilevich's shadow stretches further than ever, not through violence or visibility, but through the quiet sophistication of systems he helped pioneer. Crime in the 21st century no longer looks like men in leather jackets exchanging envelopes. It looks like encrypted transactions, shell companies with no employees, anonymous servers hosted on islands, and corporate structures so tangled that even governments struggle to untie them. And this is where Mogilevich's fingerprints still appear, not physically, but ideologically. Investigators examining modern financial crimes often talk about the Mogilevich model, a method of laundering that uses legitimate businesses, legal loopholes, political influence, and psychological misdirection. A method that never requires the mastermind to be present. A method that turns crime into an invisible, self-running machine. In many ways, Mogilevich became less of a criminal and more of a concept, one that transformed the underworld into a global network of partnerships, manipulated markets, and silent agreements. A concept that taught criminals to think like businessmen, and businessmen to think like criminals. Even in his old age, living quietly in Russia, he remains an enigma. He rarely speaks to the media. He avoids public events. He lives behind walls that are more political than physical. Some former associates say he enjoys his retirement, walking slowly through his private garden, reading newspapers and drinking tea. Others swear he still signs off on major operations through trusted intermediaries. But everyone agrees on one thing: Mogilevich never leaves anything to chance. Over the years, a few brave journalists have attempted to revisit his story, hoping to expose new crimes or uncover hidden details. Many of them discovered what previous reporters already learned: you don't chase Mogilevich's truth without consequences. Sources disappear, records vanish, interviews fall apart, doors close before they're even knocked on. No single man should have the power to reshape markets, influence politics, manipulate global supply chains, and silence international investigations. Yet Mogilevich did exactly that, not through brute force, but through strategy. He mastered the art of invisibility, leaving others to carry out the visible risks while he stayed several layers removed, and perhaps that is why he remains free. For law enforcement, capturing Mogilevich is no longer about finding a fugitive. It is about untangling decades of corruption woven into the fabric of governments, businesses, and global economics. If he were ever placed on trial, the fallout could expose thousands of names, hundreds of corporations, and dozens of states. It could destabilize markets, threaten political alliances, and reveal truths the world is not prepared to handle. This is the silent protection that has kept him safe for nearly half a century. Even now, if someone attempts to trace his fortune, the trail dissolves into networks of front companies, offshore accounts, art holdings, energy intermediaries, and corporate trusts registered under people who may not even know they are involved. The complexity is not an accident. It is the core of his survival. But the biggest question remains, where does the story end? Does a man like Mogilevich ever truly retire? Does he slowly fade into obscurity, leaving behind an empire others now control? Or does he remain quietly active, orchestrating from afar, shaping events without leaving a trace? Some believe he is still one of the most influential unseen forces in Eastern Europe. Others believe he handed everything over to younger oligarchs and criminal strategists who carry on his methods. And there is a darker theory, that Mogilevich's real power now lies not in crime, but in the wealth and information he possesses, enough to bargain with any government on earth. After all, a man who knows the secrets of presidents, millionaires, intelligence officers, and criminal empires is not just dangerous, he is irreplaceable. And that is his greatest shield. Today, documentaries, journalists, and analysts continue to call him the most dangerous mob boss in the world. Yet ironically, those who knew him well never described him as fearsome. They described him as quiet, thoughtful, calculated. A man who preferred books over gunfights, numbers over violence, and patience over impulse. But that perhaps is what made him the most dangerous of all, because in a world obsessed with power, Semion Mogilevich learned how to create a different kind of empire. One that cannot be raided, one that cannot be photographed, one that cannot be dismantled by police. An empire built not on fear, but on systems. Not on bullets, but on knowledge. Not on loyalty, but on dependency. And as long as those systems remain, so does his legacy. In the end, Mogilevich's story is not just the story of one man. It is the story of how crime evolved, how it adapted, expanded, and merged with legitimate structures until the lines disappeared entirely. It is the story of how a single mind reshaped the underworld and then reshaped the world above it. Whether he is sitting quietly at home or still pulling strings behind the scenes, one truth remains. Semion Mogilevich did not just escape justice, he outgrew it.